Hi, it's Karen, and welcome to part two of our conversation with Dr. Jake Veasey. If you haven't listened to part one, I strongly encourage you to go back and have a listen to part one of this conversation. If you're time poor, even just if you listen to the last 10 minutes or so of part one, that will help you get into this episode much more easily. I just wanted to give you some definitions of a couple of terms that Jake touches on. So one is enrichment. Enrichment is something that carers will provide to animals in captivity to improve their welfare. So it'll be usually some kind of activity. Sometimes it's related to feeding, maybe it's opportunities to bathe, or all sorts of different behaviours that enhance the welfare of the animal. So Jake talks a little bit about enrichment with tigers. So that's one term. The other term is stereotypic. If you're not familiar with that term, that refers to a behaviour that an animal will perform. Usually they only perform these behaviours when they're in captivity, and it's often a sign that the animal's needs aren't being met. And so it's usually a repetitive behaviour. So you might have seen, for example, if we're talking about tigers, them pacing up and down the enclosure. In horses, they might crib bite or windsuck. Sometimes for dogs, they can lick. It can be a stereotypic behaviour. So there's just a couple of terms to help you. If you're really super time poor, we don't start talking about horses specifically in this episode until around the 15-minute mark. But I encourage you to listen to the first half of the podcast, because Jake gives us a wonderful example of what the enclosure might look like for a tiger to give them really great welfare. And then we go on and talk about, well, how could we potentially adapt that approach for horses? It's a fantastic episode. Mita and I really hope you enjoy it, and thanks again for joining us. We are entering this conversation in part two with Dr. Jake Veasey, with Jake talking about the needs of tigers. That then he goes on to discuss best practice in tiger care in relation to those needs. It's a fascinating conversation, and then we go on to talk in a similar vein about horses. Really hope you enjoy it. Let's go.
Theoretically, a tiger doesn't need to hunt to survive, but a tiger does need to maintain a territory. And a tiger's territory is proportional to its prey density. That's the thing that dictates the territory size of a tiger. And so to understand how big a territory it needs to maintain, it needs to monitor prey density over time. It also needs to protect all of these resources from other tigers. So it needs to gather information about what's going on, within the neighborhood in relation to other tigers. It's also key to accessing reproductive opportunities. So tigers have a flexible relationship with how they acquire food, but a fixed relationship with information gathering. And so when you kind of understand this, your kind of management goals and objectives for this species fundamentally change. And because zoos never understood this, it was always been kind of understood that hunting was this really important thing, because they're big scary tigers, they got big teeth, and for some reason we're kind of drawn to these elements. We recognize them as a big predator. And so the enrichment has been geared around kind of maximizing positive opportunities in relation to hunting. And so what zoos do is they create enrichment events in relation to food acquisition, and to maximize the number of those, they have these enrichment events once a day. They have these going up a feeding pole or going out into the habitat and searching for bits of meat. And to stop them becoming morbidly obese, obviously these meals are smaller than they would typically experience in the wild. And because these meals are smaller, captive tigers are rarely experiencing that species-specific stomach distension, a stretching of the stomach wall that they would experience in the wild when they're, consuming anything up to 20% of their body weight in a single meal. And the motivation to go looking for food in tigers is down to receptors in the stomach wall. If it's not stretched enough, they are permanently motivated to look for food. And so because the zoos never understood what truly mattered to tigers, they maximize these hunting opportunities in a way that precluded tigers from feeling full up in a species appropriate way, meaning they were permanently motivated to look for food in environments in which they were permanently frustrated from doing so. So I'm convinced the existing kind of conceptions of best practice for tigers are actually having a negative impact on tiger welfare. So we are devising habitats that reconnect travel and information gathering with kind of securing motivated outcomes. And what we see in kind of zoo design is this incremental kind of tweaking and finessing of what previous generations have done. The habitat we're kind of developing is so fundamentally different. It actually took an animal welfare NGO to kind of say, do you know what, we're going to give this a go. The science makes sense, and we're willing to kind of, to invest in that, because I think it scared a lot of other people because it was so radically different. And so having undertaken this assessment, and what's great about this process is, we get anything up to, 40 experts from around the world who participate, and they all come with different backgrounds. And what's really great about it is it doesn't matter whether you work with a species in captivity or in the wild, or if you're a welfare scientist, and even people who are kind of anti-captivity. Everyone agrees on the output, and we would not just kind of verbally. It's like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. But statistically, we can compare the data, every single one we've done so far. There's this really strong agreement. They're a great way of building consensus as well. Where the challenge then comes is, what do you do with this information? So people agree on the output. Things get serious when we start discussing, well, hey, we can do this or we can do that. But what it does is it provides a blueprint for what good could look like. It provides a challenge. It's essentially establishing performance criteria for habitats rather than, because one of the other things we're seeing is existing best practice is so often there's a mismatch between what we are discovering is important and existing conceptions of best practice, as hopefully that example with the tigers illustrates. So now that we recognize that actually intentional travel and gathering information is important, and we also understand that captivity doesn't limit the extent to which tigers travel. They can actually travel more in a captive space than they do often in the wild. What it does is it eliminates the purpose to travel, so it becomes stereotypic. When you kind of factor all of these kind of things into the design of a habitat, we start coming out with just radically different solutions. So the habitat that we're currently building, it's Four Paws International. We've been working with those guys for many years. They have sanctuaries around the world. I think there's around 14 sanctuaries. They care for many hundreds of big cats and bears. And so they're motivated not just to improve the welfare of a rescued individual, but also to kind of raise the bar in terms of not just what they do across their sanctuary network, but also to establish a new reference point for best practice. So what we're building for tigers in Germany with Four Paws International is a habitat that is comprised of a core uh, area that will all start making sense. Is essentially a labyrinth. There is this kind of core bamboo forest labyrinth, this complex network of forest trails. And again, one of the other things to understand about tigers is they don't randomly move for a landscape. You know, the forest habitats they come from have well trodden game trails, and it's an efficient way to travel for a landscape. So they follow this network. And again, this is another thing to understand is whilst their home range may be very big, the actual areas that they cover are much smaller because they follow these kind of linear paths. So we're essentially replicating that. We're seeking to compress the functional complexity of the wild into large captive habitats. So we have this labyrinth, and it is connected to four distinct physically different characteristics. You know, so we have densely forested habitats, we have highly elevated habitats, we have habitats with, you know, a greater proportion of water, and we have, you know, the kind of the denning areas. Overlaid on these different physically distinct opportunities, we create not unpredictable but variable goals. So relating to feeding opportunities, we signal, you know, in the aquatic habitat, you know, there's a deer barking that can signal the possibility that there may be a feeding opportunity in that location. And where the labyrinth comes in, it's not like when we deliberately use the word labyrinth, it's not a maze. We're not trying to get these animals lost. We're trying to create a complex three-dimensional space that they have to navigate through. So what this navigate does, it actually adapts to the choices the animals make. So there are various kind of decision points within this maze that have a cascading effect on how the gates configure, and it creates a consistent journey through this maze that we can make, effectively an infinite length. But we don't just change the physical route through this, what is a living forested landscape. We change acoustic signals. We have scent boxes in there that trigger different blends of smells so that they can establish a cognitive map of this, complex landscape that requires them it compels them to make challenging decisions. Because if it was a hot sunny day and you wanted to get out the sun, but you're also thirsty, it was, in a traditional zoo environment, it doesn't matter, it's a 2-minute walk. It's 2 minutes, what am I kidding? It's a 5-second walk to your watering trough and then a 6-second walk to get some shelter. If you're desperate to get out the sun and you're also really thirsty and you have to walk 3 kilometers to get to water and 4 kilometers in the other direction to get access to shade, suddenly they become meaningful choices. And so it's not just about what we're physically requiring these animals to do, what this landscape physically requires them to do. It's all of the cognitive processes that are linked to that. They will become better at making choices. They will become better at kind of, making the judgments of I'm not going to waste my time going to investigate that food signal because it's 8 kilometers away and experience tells me I only get food 1 in 5 times when the amplitude of deer barking is such. So it's placing cognitive demands. And I think to kind of summarize the difference between the approach we're trying to develop and traditional animal care is we're not trying to solve problems for animals. We're trying to create environments in which they are empowered to solve challenges that they are in control of. They decide whether, it's not keepers deciding, hey, it's feeding time now. It's animals that are deciding, do you know what? I'm actually not that hungry today. It's hot, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to investigate that potential feeding opportunity. And so it introduces a whole bunch of other things that I think that no one really pays that much attention to, like things like failure and making bad choices. If everything is great, then nothing is that great. And so the opportunity to have walked for 4 kilometers and not got the thing that you walked there for, whilst it may feel like, well, that's a bad thing, why would you do that? What it does is it elevates the value of those good choices and good outcomes when you make them. So it's so multifaceted. Everything kind of knits together, and this is another thing that is that comes out of this process and our approach is you can't compartmentalize all of these things. They're all connected. Cognition, travel, everything is connected. And what the AURPIS process does is give us this kind of high level overview of the things that matter so that we can start knitting those things together. But this issue of intentional travel is definitely something that kind of connects all of these things, and it's the behavioral and cognitive glue that combines so many things that are important to animals, because like I say, it's this precursor to motivational equilibrium.
That is just so incredible. But what it shows to me, Jake, is you've almost, like, you've completely flipped around the mindset of the role of the person caring for the animal, in a sense. Like,
absolutely, I think animal care professionals need to recalibrate from considering that their role is to take care of the animals, and instead consider their role is to provide the animals opportunities that it can take care of itself. So rather than providing food, it's providing environments in which animals can secure food. And obviously there's a massive overlap between these two things, but it is a fundamental mindset difference.
yeah. So you've touched on a couple of times about best practice in tiger care. What I would like to now move over to would be best practice in caring for horses, because we're a horse podcast.
Sure.
So traditionally, people have kept horses in very small spaces, sport horses anyway. So horses for racing and equestrian sport are kept in stables, which are typically quite small. So
Yeah.
how would you relate that type of environment for a horse, and how would you see that we could map a way forward to make a better environment for the horse?
So before kind of delving too deeply into horses, I want to kind of acknowledge I am not a horse person at all. So we haven't done one of these assessments for horses, but I've worked with wild equids for many years, and obviously they're not all the same. And one of the challenges I think with horses is there's always going to be this argument that they're domesticated and therefore none of this stuff applies. And I think I think whether it's domestic cats, dogs, or whatever, absolutely domestication has influenced the behavioral needs of these species, but it's certainly not eradicated them. And so I think we look at wild equid species that are out there, onagers, kulang, and Przewalski wild horse. I think they are valuable reference points, despite that kind of domestication. So One of the assessments that we have done, there are a number of things that pop out as being quite important. Sociality is one. If a species is social, then that becomes quite a fundamental need. It's not something that you can disregard lightly. As we've already touched on, travel is really important. And then obviously it was related to the acquisition of food, and even, animals hydrate. We've done some work on lions, and in nature, when you see lions feeding at drinking at a watering hole, it's the entire pride. It's a big social event, and yet we design these solitary drinkers. And like I say, I'm not a horse expert. I don't horses. Certainly with zebras, you rarely see an individual at a watering hole. You often see whole groups. So it's just thinking about moving beyond the ticking that physiological box. We allow animals to rest. We allow them to drink. We give them food. We need to kind of look at the behavioral and cognitive processes that are wrapped around that in the wild. And certainly with horses, I can imagine sociality and that opportunity to kick up your heels and run around as being really important. One of the things that we in our whole facility kind of audit framework, one of the metrics that we take is the extent to which animals can travel at maximum velocity for 15 body lengths. It enables us to create a metric in relation to the size of habitats that kind of corrects for the size of the animal, but also the functional ecology of the animal. And actually, this seemingly arbitrary metric is a really powerful predictor of welfare states. And it's not necessarily the ability of animals to run or fly or swim at maximum velocity is the key determining factor, but it co-varies with a whole bunch of other opportunities that also increase as these opportunities do. But, certainly if you were to design an environment that did a really good job of going against the fundamental needs of horses, it would be a single stalled box of a hay rack. Because, they've evolved to graze, they spend a lot of time grazing. That is a need, and I don't believe hay racks equate to that same, they tick the physiological box. I'm not convinced they tick that behavioral box of making selections. There's thistles there. I'm not taking that. I'm going, this is good grass here, and this patch isn't quite providing me the nutritional needs I need. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to do that with my herd mates, and I'm watching what's going on, and all of the stuff associated with food acquisition is so much more complicated than I think we often give it credit for. So I think what we see with horses is a management system that is configured around our ability to manage them and not their kind of satisfy their fundamental needs. And it just literally thinking about it now, you almost couldn't design an environment that was more at odds with their behavioral ecology than the one that we often see horses kept in.
And if I'm done,
I'm not a horse guy.
If I'm to understand what you say, there are things we could do. Okay, given that a single stall stable is not a good environment, but there are things we can do to improve that environment, or things we should be thinking about doing to meet those behavioural needs without turning them loose on the prairie. It's back to that question early on about horses are captive animals. So, are there ways we can make a more diverse environment for them that could help?
Yeah. So, I mean, when it comes back to this kind of concept of peak welfare, I managed zebra in big facilities, 60, 70 acre facilities in which they're wandering around amongst antelope and rhinos and giraffe and various things. And, okay, I mean, one of the things people have to kind of understand about Africa is it's not universally hot, and as in particularly the more open areas, it can get really cold at night. So, notwithstanding that there may be climatic challenge differences, they tend to be within the broad comfort zones of big, large mammals like zebras. But having recognized that climate may have some influence on welfare, a zebra in a large, complex environment in which it has the opportunity to kick up its heels and run at maximum velocity. As a herd, it can feed, it can graze, it can even browse if the fancy takes it, but it's protected from drought, it's protected from untreated injuries, it's protected from predation, it's protected from starvation. I think zebras are a species that we probably can say, do you know what? It's not beyond our ability to provide a higher standard of welfare for a captive zebra than it would be for a wild, for most wild zebras that, the vast majority don't survive to reach adulthood. And so I think the same is possibly true with horses. There's no reason why it shouldn't be. And in fact, the fact that they have undergone domestication should make it easier. So when I don't want to say that, these single stall boxes are bad per se, because there's, it's actually identifying what is the purpose for keeping these animals. And I think, these single stall boxes, there is a management reason for that. We just have to understand the welfare consequences of that. We see crib biting, we see a whole bunch of kind of reactions to that environment, and it's just kind of balance. It's accepting those costs, I think, is the first step on the journey, is accepting that is not necessarily, it may be routine and it may be what most people do, but in terms of welfare, it's not necessarily best practice. And therefore, how can we integrate these behavioral needs into management that doesn't stop us, whatever the role these horses have, and because captive horses have a role, how can we integrate their behavioral and cognitive needs in a way that doesn't, eliminate the function that they have for horse owners? I'm probably not making a huge amount of sense because I'm thinking
No,
on
no.
the foot about this. But
I met a prominent horse breeder just before Christmas, and I had just finished my master's and graduated. And I think she probably saw it on social media. But anyway, she said, "Oh, well done. That's really good." She said, "So equine welfare, and what have you learned?" And I said, "Well, funny enough, one of the things that struck me is that zoo animal welfare has a lot of parallels with equine welfare." Now, she was quite taken aback when I said that, but I suppose I was thinking about that in both situations you have captive animals, and in both situations one of their functions is entertainment. And one of the questions we ask our guests is where they see the future of horse sport, in whatever timeline they like to think of. And because of those parallels, I'm just wondering where you see the future of zoos.
Well, listen, this is really interesting because I think I started this by talking about my frustration with this perceived tension between welfare and conservation, and one of the things, this whole facility audit tool that we've developed, one of the really most exciting things about this is we've developed this quite sophisticated framework for assessing the welfare across an entire facility, and we look at 23 different characteristics that influence habitat quality, management, healthcare, but also manifestations of welfare states. And so we create this holistic overview of welfare capability of particular habitats. What's been really exciting about this process is when we ask visitors which habitats they enjoy and which habitats they think have good welfare, there's a super strong correlation between our holistic welfare framework, visitors' levels of enjoyment, and even their perceptions of animal happiness. And so there is no conflict between good welfare and the commercial imperative of zoos to generate income to take care of animals. They're one and the same. And in fact, the biggest risk to zoos is their failure to address the fundamental needs of animals. And linked to that is the risk in assuming the public are less aware than they are. And one of the other things that and I'm just aware I'm talking to veterinarians here, or at least one, is that when we ask veterinarians what they believe, what habitats provide the best welfare, because they come at this from this health management perspective, we actually see an inverse relationship between what they require to manage welfare and this holistic welfare assessment. And so we can almost know too much. We can become so embedded in sector-specific best practice that we lose that intuitive understanding about animal welfare that I think humans as social species have. And so we have a bizarre scenario where some of the most qualified people in the zoo have a different perception on the welfare capacity of a habitat than the public. And actually, the public's is probably more accurate because they have less of a filter and it's more intuitive. And getting back to welfare, I think that's one thing that the equine community needs to be cognizant of. You're so embedded in that community and it's an echo chamber. You look at what everyone else does within that community, and that determines what best practice is. But the public have an intuitive understanding of what good looks like, and actually our evidence shows that they have a greater understanding than we give them credit for. And so as animal welfare kind of moves up the agenda in terms of importance that people put on animal welfare, I think the equine community would do well to just be cognizant of the fact that you can't say, hey, we're the experts, we know best. Because as we saw with cetaceans in North America, it doesn't wash. And so, having that slightly more holistic consideration, certainly in the UK, there's been efforts to make, RB less kind of risky. And I think I can anticipate in 20, 30 years' time, there's going to be maybe less than that. There's going to be an interest in, okay, that's great. We're not getting horses killed during races, but what also is their life like outside of the spotlight when we're not seeing them at a race? What is the 99.999% of their life, and a greater interrogation of that, and maybe best practice being configured around those elements as well, and the amount of time animals can be in a herd situation and have capacity to free time and free space. I would anticipate all of these things would and should start having a bearing. What I would say is I would absolutely encourage the community to be proactive on that. Don't wait until you're compelled to do it. Get out on the front foot. Integrating the thinking and that approach at the outset. What I would say is undertake one of these AUPIS assessments before you do anything, because it's amazing. We've not done a single one where there hasn't been surprises. We have experts from a whole range of things. For every species we've done, there's been some stuff that, wow, I would have never have guessed that. And these, as we saw with tigers, these things can be the things that really unlock welfare that no one's really thought about before.
Well, that's a great note on which to finish. So for someone who professes not to know much about horses, Jake, you have hit every note of the current concerns we all have, and you've provided some really, really interesting suggestions. So, no, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, well, no, thank you, and again, apologies if I if I get a little bit too animated and excited, but this is such a big topic, and there are so many strands that you could kind of unpick or almost ad infinitum, and again to your kind of equine listeners, again, apologies for my ignorance on the species. What I can only talk about the generalities of how we can approach these challenges. But yeah, I think there is huge opportunities to improve captive equine welfare. I think the biggest challenge is it's likely to need a bit of a reset. It's not, it's not more of the same. It's not dialing up this and adjusting that. It needs a fundamental reset.
Yeah, and please don't apologise for not being an equine specialist. Like, one of the things that we are really keen to do is try and bring a whole diverse range of perspectives to the challenge, because it's a complex challenge, and I think, like you say, if we just do more of the same, we're unlikely to come up with anything sort of successful. To just twiddling around the edges. So thank you so much for sharing, all of your knowledge about tigers.
Yeah, sorry, and again, we're trying to close up, and there's me kind of seeing. I think one of the other challenges is the thing about this kind of echo chamber is the industry is configured around its own conceptions of best practice. And so it becomes self-replicating. And that's where what I mean by a reset is not that I mean everything needs to be torn up. You actually need to step out of that echo chamber and look back in and have a different reference point. And that is what we find this welfare priority assessment tool does, is it takes everyone out of there. We're not assessing an individual's welfare. We're not assessing the quality of a specific habitat. We're getting down to the nuts and bolts of what is really important to this species. Forget what we currently do. Forget current conceptions of best practice. What are the evolved fundamental needs of this species? And then, once that process has been undertaken, it comes, okay, how do we overlay that with what we're currently doing? And so that's what I mean by a reset. It's not that we tear everything up, but we step out, we look at it through this different lens, and then we come back in and start adapting, adjusting, and amending what we're currently doing.
Thank you so much, Jake. Really, that was so stimulating and thought-provoking.
So, Jake, could we undertake one of these audits for horses?
Absolutely. The tool, it's a process that is designed to identify welfare priorities regardless of species. And I think it'd be really exciting to do it for horses. And I'm absolutely certain, based on all of the ones that we've undertaken, they're going to be surprises, and it will provide, a very different reference point to recalibrate how we understand best practice.
Wow, wasn't that amazing? One thing that struck me is Jake talks about information gathering being so important for tigers, and it reminded me a little bit of what we're about here on Changing Rain, because we don't see ourselves as an educational forum in that we're not pushing what we think might be educational for our listeners. We are helping them do that information gathering, so that together we can build a sustainable future for horse sport. I think the biggest message from Jake is that we are currently managing our horses in a way that suits our needs rather than the horse's needs. And that is our biggest challenge, to integrate those behavioural needs with the role that horses now perform for us. And the mega challenge, of course, is the holistic assessment of horses' behavioural needs. This could potentially be the underpinning of a sustainable future. If you have ideas about how this might happen, who could make it happen, how it could be supported, please let us know. If you enjoyed Jake's 2 episodes, please tell your friends, please subscribe, and help grow Changing Rain. We're really enjoying the podcast, and we hope you are too.